This is a spaceship, a virtual spaceship, for traveling in time, fueled up and ready to go. Let's blast off on a journey to the Time Warp Tavern, a friendly pub with a difference. Join Russell and Lawrence there as they revisit their experiences of life as two young boys growing up in the 1960s.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
What will they be talking about today?
Down to Brighton, and we were listening to, I think, Radio 5 Live.
Oh yeah.
And they were on a particular topic. They were homing in, they had people ringing in. We found out the commentator, he was the voice of NASA, and he would be telling you, there's 5 minutes to go, and now they're pressurising the oxygen tanks, and now they're doing this and that.
Yeah, a certain type of voice to keep you engaged, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
And they've got to give that sense of the wonders of the universe.
Yeah.
So you're actually going to the Kennedy Space Centre then, finally, the place where it all stems from.
Yeah.
So has this been something that's been a long time coming? You've always wanted to do it.
Yes. About 50 years now.
About 50 years.
Yeah.
Oh, so a modest amount of time then. What made you do it now?
If I don't do it now, it's never going to happen.
So what's actually at the Kennedy Space Centre then?
Well, is where all of the American space missions were launched. The only thing I hope is that it's not going to be like a Disney World tour, you know.
Oh, yeah,
That'd
yeah.
be...
Is it purely a museum these days?
No, they still do launches there.
Oh, they do, right, okay.
It's still a working facility, but it's where all the Apollo stuff happened, so that's why I'm interested.
It was a big part of growing up in the 60s, wasn't it? The space missions, the moon.
I saw the moon last night, actually. I thought, how does the moon know that it has to keep going around the Earth?
Yeah.
How would it know that it has to keep going around it? Why doesn't it just go off? It all goes back to Einstein's general theory of relativity, that gravity is all about warped space. So the reason it knows where to go is that it's trying to go in a straight line, but actually what it's doing is following the curvature of the space. It's like a railway line, and it's following the railway line, but the railway line just happens to go in a circle.
I mean, it's interesting when you think people have actually devoted their whole lives to trying to answer these questions, you know.
Well, there's a particular scientist I'm very fond of called Paul Davies. He's a bit like James Burke. He's really good at explaining difficult concepts in a way that you can sort of understand it.
All right. So he's the sort of person you'd want to invite to a dinner party.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to invite Brian Cox, let's put it that way. That's the difference between somebody that actually puts the concept of space across well and somebody who doesn't.
He gives us the play school version of
space.
That's
right.
Yeah, I prefer boring old serious boffins.
So do I, yeah. Yeah, people that are experts at the subject, they make no concessions to like TV celebrities or personalities. They come on, they talk about their subjects. They're enthusiastic about the subject and they know a lot about it and you can take a lot from it.
Yeah.
But they don't have to look sexy.
Exactly.
You know?
I mean, Patrick Moore's a classic example, isn't he?
Yeah. From my earliest memories, you know, missions into space were always there.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember a time when they weren't. So I sort of grew into that.
You had the Gemini program.
That's right, yeah.
Which went from about 63 to 66.
It was this rush towards, man getting into space.
Yes, it was definitely a thing. I was lucky enough to get the Action Man space capsule.
Oh, yeah.
I was absolutely delighted. But the trouble is, when you did splashdown in the bath, when it returned from orbit, it used to leak, water would pour in because it wasn't meant to go in the bath. And I thought, well, that's not right because when they come back from space, they land in the ocean. And I remember Action Man, it's very good. It was based on the Mercury capsule. And Action Man had this brilliant silver spacesuit that he used to put on him. And it really reminded me of the lining you used to get in the Sugar Puffs packets.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember the kind of like foil lining?
Yes, I do, yeah. To keep them fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And the other thing about Sugar Puffs was that once they'd been soaked in milk for a while, it smelled like wee-wee. Don't know if you ever noticed that?
Yeah, and it also coloured the milk, didn't it?
Yeah.
They used to go sort of grey, didn't it?
It did.
But, the space race, it was all around you, though, wasn't it? I mean, I can just remember pre-Beatles, and we had Telstar, the Tornadoes record.
Yeah.
And it was like a little soundtrack to what was going on.
It was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, and it was all so futuristic and...
It was like monorails. It was all to do with that, wasn't it?
Yeah, and Professor Eric Laithwaite.
Oh, yeah. My earliest childhood memories of space were all comics and TV memories.
Well, if you go back to the early 60s,
Yeah.
a lot of the chocolate bars were based on space. So you had Galaxy.
True.
Milky Way.
That's right, yeah.
Mars,
yeah.
Yeah.
I'd never even thought about that, but it's right, isn't it? I'm sure that was an inspiration. Yeah, I remember when, TV21 comic came, didn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It always had a dateline of, 2165, set in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And, breakfast cereals, they always had, 3 space rockets in them or something like that, didn't they? You couldn't escape it.
Yes, it was very sexy, wasn't it? It was.
Because that would have fully realised our vision of the future in the 1960s, wouldn't it?
Yeah, everybody feels part of the same thing.
That's right. And it defined our childhood.
Yeah. I think it was really Apollo that kind of brought it alive.
But we were sort of primed because you had all these different things which referred to space, didn't you? Like Fireball XL5.
Yeah. It was still a black and white world, wasn't it?
Yeah. It changed overnight, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's like somebody turned the colour control up. I mean, it really was a revolution, wasn't it?
I sort of tie it all in together, like futuristic fiction in comics.
Yeah.
And the coming of colour TV. It's all to do with science, technology and the space race.
Exactly. The jet age.
Yeah.
Concorde, Evoluon.
That's right.
The Apollo space program. It all tied in.
And if you got an advert on TV for Zoom or something, Ice Lolly, it was Jerry Anderson.
And you might have Jeff Tracy telling you about the Zoom Lolly with this wonderful green ice.
In 3 flavour stages.
Zoom, that was one of my favourite lollies.
Zoom or Orbit, or Skyray. That was the other one, wasn't it? That's what I mean. All the adverts, they were all to do with space, weren't they?
They were, yes.
Yeah.
Thunderbirds. The names of all of the pilots.
Yeah.
Scott, John.
Yeah. Alan.
Virgil.
Gordon.
Yeah. And who were they named after?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sure you're going to tell me though.
They were all named after the Mercury American Space Program astronauts.
Were they?
Alan was Alan Shepard.
Right.
Virgil was Virgil Grissom. Yeah. And then John Glenn.
First man to orbit the Earth, yeah.
Scott Carpenter. Gordon Cooper.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Those very early Jerry Anderson series, they really did tap into that interest in space, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And yet, I mean, I've been to the Science Museum a number of times.
Yeah.
And they've got the command module from Apollo 10, which came back.
Have they? They've got the real thing.
They've got the actual real capsule. And when you look at it, it looks like something out of an H.G. Wells novel. It really looks like Victorian engineering.
Yeah.
You see there's bits of wire hanging off, and it just all looks like something from the 19th century.
Mr. Heath and Mr. Robinson.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And you think, this thing went round the moon and came back. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is funny when you think about it like that.
And they were stuck inside it. Well, another little interesting observation about that is, I don't know if you remember Valentina Tereshkova. She was the first woman in space.
I remember the name, yeah.
And I went to an exhibition of Russian spacecraft at the Science Museum. And it didn't happen on the day I was there, but she was there at one point and gave a little talk. And they had the actual space capsule she came back with, Soyuz space capsule. She was talking about, all the problems they had and everything. But then she kind of patted spacecraft and said, but he got me home. He got me home.
Right.
And I thought that's really interesting because everyone else who has a space capsule or a racing car or a speedboat, they normally give it a female name, not a male name.
Maybe it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, I think it must be. But one of the exhibits there was the moon landing craft that the Russians had developed.
Oh, right.
Which was going to be their machine they were going to put on the moon. And it looks like a 1950s vacuum cleaner from the United States.
You think, how did this fly?
How the hell would this thing get to the moon?
Yeah.
And they were going to send a single astronaut on his own.
I think that would have been a disaster, actually, sending one person.
I think it would have been.
Yeah. I think you've got to have a second person for A, moral support, and B, a different perspective. big John Kennedy speech, wasn't it, about having a man on the moon before the decade's
we choose
out.
to go to the moon, and but every time I watch a space documentary, they always put that at the beginning. I get sick to death of it, really.
I mean, it was happening before that. It might have accelerated the whole thing, but
well, of course, the whole Apollo program was really politically motivated, and the Americans thought, well, we've got to do something. What can we do?
Yeah.
And I think it was Johnson.
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson came up with the idea, well, look, if they've beaten us into space, let's tell them we're going to be the first ones to go to the moon then.
Regardless of whether we can do it or not.
Yeah, and they had no idea how to do it at that time.
I think it's a miracle that they got there and back on that first mission, actually.
It really is, when you consider how fragile the whole thing was.
Yeah. Eventually, there were manned missions. They weren't landing anywhere. But when they sent a new mission up, you wondered if they were going to come back, didn't you?
Oh, God, yeah. And it takes a certain type of person, I think, to be an astronaut.
Yeah.
To take on those risks and still be able to kind of keep a clear mind and think clearly when you've got problems and all that.
Yeah. Do you remember when you first caught a glimpse of the sky at night? The TV programme.
Well, I mean, gosh, it goes way back into the 60s, doesn't it?
Yeah. Patrick Moore was one of the big advocates of space,
wasn't
he?
Yeah.
I mean, he used to, go overboard about everything, didn't he?
He was highly enthusiastic, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got some stuff of him talking to James Burke, and he did really, really excited about it. And it's absolutely brilliant. I've got a classic interview that Patrick Moore did with Neil Armstrong.
Oh, yeah.
Just after they'd landed on the moon.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he's talking about future exploration. And Neil Armstrong said, oh, yes. He said, I'm quite certain that within 10 years we'll have bases on the moon and people will be visiting it. And I mean, that was 1969, so he was thinking that by 1979, 1980, there'd be bases on the moon.
Well, it's quite right, because, we had women with purple wigs inhabiting the moon base, didn't we?
Yes.
And Ed Straker.
UFO, that's true, with Peter Gordino.
Yeah, but that was set in 1980, though, so Neil Armstrong was obviously correct, I mean, when I was that age, I thought this is what the future's going to be like.
Yeah.
I mean, I can actually remember around about 1969, 70, just after we'd had the Apollo thing, and everything was quite swinging. I had this vision of the year 2000, and it was like everybody would be working on computers,
Yeah.
Our food would be pills.
Yep.
The other detail was that everybody would look like Jason King. It didn't exactly come to pass.
No, sadly no.
You just thought that the future was going to go on in the same way that the 60s had gone on. You thought the 70s were going to be more so.
Well, I remember the film The Time Machine.
Oh, Time Machine,
which I think was made in about 58 or 59. And
Yeah.
there's a bit where he goes forward into the future.
Yeah.
And he goes forward to 1967, and he comes out of his little time machine thing, and he's walking up and down this street in a futuristic city, and there's all these like metro tubes going over the top, and people walking down the high street in spacesuits.
Well, they're monorails by any chance.
They would have been.
Yeah.
And that's what they thought life would be like in 1967.
So there were no hippies, no flower children or anything.
They hadn't anticipated that. But brilliant film, though.
I like it, yeah. But there was a lot of that, wasn't there? Right through the 50s, there's a lot of science fiction films, wasn't there? Things like Forbidden Planet and The Day the Earth Stood Still, all those.
A little bit like Lost in Space, actually.
Yes. All these films, they were all kind of looking ahead. They were trying to think what it was going to be like in a few years' time, wasn't it? It was like they were projections. I mean, that was really before space travel, wasn't it?
Yes, it was an exciting time. And kind of in parallel with that, you had things like Concorde coming along. And it was all part of the space age.
But it's interesting, when you look at all those Jerry Anderson series, up until a certain point, they were all about space, weren't they? And rockets and astronauts.
Yes.
Supercar, 5 Thunderbirds.
Yes.
And they all changed, didn't they, after that? Because there was suddenly a focus on the Earth, wasn't there? They became more everyday, sort of identifiable, didn't they? Because you had Joe 90 and then Secret Service.
Yes.
They only went back to space with UFO, didn't they? After the Apollo missions.
Yes.
It's almost like it re-energised it a little bit there.
That's true.
All those series, I mean, Space Patrol as well, they're all about space. And then they suddenly just did an about turn, didn't they?
Yes. I suppose it kind of sort of almost like a reflection of society, isn't it?
It was taken over by real events at that point, wasn't it? Space missions were actually taking off in real life, and it was almost like we can't compete with them, so we won't try. How and when were you first drawn to space as an interest when you were young?
I was aware of. I can just vaguely remember the talk about the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin.
Yeah.
So I was only 3 years old,
Mm.
but I was sort of vaguely aware of it. You got the American Gemini missions, but you never saw anything live. You never saw a
No.
live launch
No.
or live pictures, so it was all a bit distant.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember bits of coverage, some of the missions before the Apollo missions, but I mean, you used to have Cliff Mitchell more and people in the studio, but it was just them kind of theorising about things, really, wasn't
Yeah.
it? With a few models.
Yes.
That was it. There were no live pictures. Until we had Telstar and satellite transmission, there was no way of seeing what was going on as it happened.
No.
When we were growing up, though, I mean, there's all these myths about, what other planets were like before we actually landed on anything at all. We had these ideas about what all the different planets in our solar system were like, about Mercury and Saturn.
Came back to Space Patrol.
Oh, Space Patrol, yeah.
We sort of assumed that each planet would have its own creatures on it.
But it's funny, we used to focus on our solar system, didn't we? As if they were all going to contain life of some sort anyway. So at the moment, we don't need to look any further than that.
That's right. Whereas actually, there's nothing there at all.
No. The truth's actually far more boring, isn't it?
No rivers or streams or jungles or anything.
Yeah.
In Australia, everyone clings to the coast because the interior is just hostile, dead, red rock, which is what Mars is like. So it's like, why would you even go there in the first place? Once you've landed there, you land on Mars and look around and you realise there's nothing there. What do you do then? Well, I'll go home then.
Yeah.
There's no lush tropical jungles or oceans. That's all there is.
Yeah, Venus was the planet that they thought was going to be lush with vegetation, didn't they, at one time?
Yes.
I remember when we were growing up, before the moon missions and that, they used to see Venus as like a big sort of tropical jungle, didn't they? Really hot.
Well, in the Space Patrol, who was the Venusian? Slim.
Yeah.
But actually, as far as I know, Venus is far too hot to land on.
Yeah.
The atmosphere is composed mostly of sulfuric acid.
Is it? Yeah.
So looks like we're sort of stuck here for the next millennium, isn't it? Really?
It does. When you see it in cosmic terms, it really feels like, we're in detention, really. We can't go home. I mean, that's what it feels like, doesn't it? We are right out on a limb in the universe, and there's no way of actually reaching any other life that's out there at the moment.
That's right. So we ought to look after what we've got, really.
Yeah, we should actually.
That would be a good idea. Apollo started about 68, actually.
68. Because they had a lot of missions, didn't they, before 11?
Apollo 7 was the first manned one, and that just orbited the Earth. And then Apollo 8 was the one that went and orbited the Moon.
Oh, yeah.
And I've still got the Beano annual that came out that year. And I remember watching, I think it was Apollo 7, which went up in October of 1968.
Oh, yeah.
And you could see them floating around the cabin. And one of them was chewing gum. And he let the chewing gum out of his mouth and it kind of floated around inside his helmet.
How slack of him.
I thought, wow, that's amazing. Imagine that. Imagine having chewing gum that could float around,
I can't imagine what it feels like to be weightless because, if you're in somewhere where there's no gravity, the simplest thing, like, for instance, if you're drinking, you've got to drink with a straw, obviously. But if you opened your mouth, it would all come out again.
Yes.
I mean, what a strange experience.
Very strange. Well, I think somebody described it. It's a bit like, when you're driving in the car and you go over a humpback bridge.
Yeah.
And you go over the humpback bridge and then there's that little moment where you go, oh, and you're falling back down. And he said, and it's like that the whole time, but you don't actually come back to the ground.
Is it really?
You have that feeling of dropping, but it just continues and you're just dropping.
Don't think I like that at all.
I don't think I would.
That sounds queasy, that does.
I mean, you see people go up in this, they call it the vomit comet, don't they?
Oh.
The plane that they trained in. But the idea of that, it's like being a high-speed lift. That horrible feeling when you suddenly go down very fast.
Yeah. I mean, it's bad enough for me when you go over that humpback bridge if you're driving,
Yeah.
So you preferred to experience it all from the safety of your living room sofa and letting Action Man take all the risks.
Yes. Well, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was fantastic when I got the Action Man space capsule. And that was modelled on the Mercury space capsule.
Oh, was it? Right.
Which was a single-person capsule. They're basically like a tin can.
Yeah.
Like a bullet being shot out of a rifle with a bloke in it. And the thing about Action Man was it wasn't about fighting wars or being in space. Basically, it was about dressing him up.
Dressing him up, yeah.
Dressing him up and then taking the dressing up.
Yeah.
So he'd be a soldier 1 minute, and then he'd take all that off, and then he'd put on his spacesuit, and then he'd be a spaceman, and then he'd take that off, and then he'd be a military policeman. It was all about dressing up and undressing. It was nothing to do with killing people or war or anything like that.
No, that's right.
It was just putting his clothes on.
But the actual Apollo missions, I mean, they were in such a short space of time. December 1968, they orbited the moon.
Yeah.
So there's still another 2 before another 6 months later they went to the moon.
Yeah, it's incredible how it all got crammed into that short space of time. And around that time, I was really getting into it. And my parents would buy me the models. I had a lunar module.
Did you?
I made. And and a command module. And it just absolutely fascinated me. And still does, even to this day. What I used to love were James Burke's little documentaries he made.
Oh, yeah.
He made loads of little short films about what they were going to do next. And
what, leading up to the moon mission? Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And James Burke was absolutely brilliant at making something complicated sound easy. He could put it across, explain something in simple terms so that you can understand it.
It's funny, though, because, however impressive the space race was, there was a hardcore of people that just weren't interested, were they?
Well, I mean, I've still got an off-air audio recording of when Grandstand was interrupted in order to see Apollo 15 walking on the moon.
Oh, right.
And Frank Boff was the presenter. So you had all this moon footage.
Yeah.
They were just opening up the lunar rover, the car that they had on. And then it cut back to Frank Boff. And you could tell, it's really funny, because you could tell he had absolutely no interest whatsoever in the moon. And he said, have you ever seen pictures like that from the moon? Absolutely fantastic. Now, at Headingley today, we've got... It's like totally dismissed it. It's like no interest whatsoever.
Sort of bringing it back to sport straight away.
Yeah.
The thing was, they did go into things in quite a lot of detail, and it was taken quite seriously, all that coverage. James Burke was great, and Patrick Moore was as well. But I happened to catch some sort of programme of The Sky at Night only not so long ago, actually. It was not so long after Patrick Moore died, I think. I hadn't seen it for years, and it was shocking how dumbed down it was. There was this woman on there who was grinning all the time and sort of waving her hands over.
Like a play school version.
Like a play school version, basically, yeah. And I thought, is this really what it's come to? I thought, I'm glad I don't watch this anymore. I thought, how can you get anybody interested in space? It was just insulting.
Yeah, I think they probably overstepped the mark. I think what they're trying to do is to make it appeal to a broader range of people who might not be that interested in technical stuff. But then you can go too far.
Yeah, I think they did. Actually, one other thing that I tie into the time of the acceleration of the space race is the film, 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Ah.
That was a big step forward, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. Christmas 68. In fact, my dad took us up to Leicester Square to see it.
Yeah.
And I remember coming out of the theatre after seeing the film, knowing that Apollo 8 was on its way to the moon at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, wow, it's really happening. It really is actually happening,
I mean, we went on a school trip, actually. It was about the beginning of December 68. I just started secondary school. And one of the things we did while in London, we went to see 2001 in Cinerama.
Cinerama,
yeah. It was a complete mind blower, that film, because it seemed like it was a documentary. I mean, the effects, the models were so good.
Yes.
I mean, it almost predated what you were going to see with Apollo.
It was so far ahead of its time.
Yeah.
But as an 11-year-old, I found it a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it was.
It had the right feel about
it. And it pushed it all into visibility, didn't it? It made us aware that moon missions were actually coming.
They were actually happening.
Yeah.
Yes.
At the time, my thinking was the Apollo mission's happening now, but looking at 2001, this is the next step. This is what it's going to be like in 100 years' time.
Yeah.
I used to think that,
Yeah, well, yes, I think I did. And I still remember to this day, on the day of the Apollo 11 launch, I was at school. The headmaster's wife was also a teacher at my school. In the afternoon play break, we were all kind of herded into her classroom, and she had TV on to watch the launch of Apollo 11. And there was obviously lots and lots of interest in this. I was slightly irritated. I said, who are all these Johnny-come-latelys that have suddenly got interest in this? I've been following this for years,
Yeah.
And also, I couldn't understand why. I said, well, why are they making such a big deal out of it? You know, they've already been to the moon, they've been in orbit around the moon, and all these guys are doing is the last little bit and landing. So then why are they making such a big deal out of it? I couldn't understand it as an 11-year-old. All these people, suddenly they're interested. And then immediately after the mission, suddenly they lost interest again. Whereas I was still there.
As you went through like the 60s, I mean, you had things like Star Trek, and you sort of imagined that future space missions were going to actually be like that, didn't you?
That's right. It was just a natural assumption it would just go on and progress.
Yeah. It was like a magnet. Anything to do with space. You know, if you had a program on television, you know, sometimes you get a documentary or a Horizon program about space or something. Yeah. And it was always the thing that I was drawn to, you know.
Oh, yeah. Well, me too. I think the thing was that, I suppose, when I was about 11, that was when the Apollo missions began. And the difference was that with the Apollo missions, they were giving live TV transmissions from space.
Yeah.
So you could actually see them doing stuff while it was actually going on. Yeah. Instead of months later on film.
Or at least you could see James Burke or Geoffrey Pardo in the studio, you know, with a baton pointing to something on a model, you know.
Yeah.
They'll be doing this at this moment.
Yeah, at this very moment, they'll be entering the hatch and they'll
That's
be...
right.
Yes.
And there'll be that little basic lettering going across the screen. It looked like it'd been done with a sort of Dymo or something, you know.
Astronauts entering space capsule.
If I had a time machine, one of the periods I'd like to go back to would be the time of the first moon landing, you know, July 69. Just to see myself sitting there with my dad in our pyjamas at 2 a.m. watching the first moonwalk live on television.
Well, I'm jealous because I slept through all of that.
Oh.
I was desperate to see it and they kept delaying it.
Yeah.
And it got to about midnight and I'll never forget, I was sitting in my bedroom at midnight and I was listening to Radio Luxembourg. And for the very first time, they played In the Year 2525. And it was so spooky, that song.
So attached to that period in time, isn't it? That very specific moment.
So I remember it got to about midnight and I was feeling very tired. I thought, well, I'll just have a little lie down for half an hour and then I'll get up again and then we'll see. Next thing I know...
You slept right through it then?
My parents had zero interest.
Really?
They were walking on the moon.
Really?
You know? It was like, that's out there somewhere. There's nothing we're interested in. We've got the shop.
I suppose they couldn't relate to it in terms of like their normal everyday life.
Exactly.
Right.
It was completely disconnected from there. So they had no interest. So I don't think they watched it. And they didn't really understand how interested I was in it.
So you had to make do with the sort of edited highlights the next morning, did you?
Yeah.
What a letdown.
I felt so disappointed. You know, I've missed probably the most significant event in my life.
Yeah.
And I bloody missed it. I do remember in the evening leading up to that, once they'd landed on the moon, and you could hear them, you know, James Burke and Patrick Moore, they're talking about it, and there was a caption on the screen. It was a bit like a test card, and it was there for hours, and it was just a cartoon drawing of the lunar module sitting on the lunar surface while they were waiting for them to get ready to come out and walk. And it was
that would be sufficient to engage people to carry on watching.
Yeah, and you could just hear James Burke chatting and say, so what do you think they're doing now? Oh, well, they're probably putting their suits on now, and then it'll be another 10 minutes and then they'll activate the oxygen systems. And I was like, oh, this is amazing, you know.
They used to have like quite detailed models, didn't they, in the studio?
Yeah.
You know, that first moon landing, it was very much like the whole world was engaged by that, wasn't it? Gripped by it for a moment. When they did the first moonwalk, it was delayed quite a long time, wasn't it?
It was.
You know, it was in the night. And for ages it said, you know, hatch now open and, you know, moonwalk due to begin and all that. And all this lettering was going across the screen all the time.
In the background, James Burke and Patrick Moore just trying to keep people's interest as it went on and on and on and on. But, you know, we were right on the brink of something historic, weren't we?
Yeah, that's right,
You know.
When the coverage wasn't on, you know, you'd sometimes have a caption on the screen instead of a test card sort of giving you updates.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
It's like everybody just wanted to know what the next thing was going to be, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was where they earned their money, these guys, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To be able to keep talking about nothing, really.
I expect that took the pressure off them, actually. If you've got a caption on screen or you've got a model on screen or something, it meant they didn't have to be in vision all the time in the studio.
Yeah.
You know, once you've gone past all the, what food do they eat, how do they go to the toilet and all that stuff, you know.
Yeah, and then there'll be... So what do you think they're thinking about now, James? You know, and how do you think they're going to react when they step down the ladder? Well, I mean, how do we know? I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
They had to make it sound like they were giving you sort of like new information.
Yeah.
But it was basically recycling something they'd said 2 hours earlier.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I remember Apollo 12, which was the one after the first moon landing.
Yeah.
They got out of the lunar module onto the surface, and one of the astronauts, Alan Bean, accidentally pointed the TV camera at the sun and burnt out the filament, and it didn't work.
I remember that happening.
So there were no live pictures from the moon. So what they had to do was, in the studio, they had to quickly erect like a model of the lunar module and a bit of a moon landscape around it.
They could have just shown a clip of UFO where they're on the moon base or something, couldn't they?
They could have done. But to his credit, Cliff Mitchellmore, he came onto the set and immediately started talking about the astronauts on the moon, what they're going to be doing, what instruments they're setting up. And he had this kind of, it was like a sandpit. It was a bit like Watch with Mother, with models and little astronauts and things going on.
Like picture book.
And he managed to kind of improvise and explain what was going on. And that's very impressive, because he's not really a science
that's right,
presenter, you know.
And as well as that, it'd be surmising about how the other astronauts would be punishing Alan Bean, you know, for doing what he did, you know.
Yeah, he's stupid. Yeah. So it was great the way they dealt with it, with an obvious enthusiasm as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Like James
well,
Byrne.
there was, wasn't there? There was enthusiasm for it. Yeah. But I remember some of the coverage, like during the Apollo 11 mission. You know, while they were on the moon. You know, BBC and ITV, they were on all day. It was on all the time. There was nothing to show, you know, when there wasn't a moonwalk or something. But it was on hours and hours during the day. And I can remember some of the coverage. It had the most tenuous kind of connection to the moon. You know, do you remember Hilary Pritchard? She played a sort of dumb blonde type, you know.
Yeah.
She went around the street doing vox pops and interviewing people.
Yes.
And saying, you know, do you think there's any chance that we'll catch space germs, you know, when they come back from the moon and that?
Yeah.
And do you think I'd get any space germs from you if you gave me a kiss? Like, so she was going around snogging people in the street.
Oh, I see.
So it was obviously very moon focused.
Right.
And there was no possibility that they'd run out of ideas and they had to fill in somehow, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it just shows you they had to keep the coverage going in some way or other.
Yes.
You know, for the whole of the duration of the Apollo 11 mission, I had the TV on all day, every day. You know, it was just gripped by it.
Yeah. I don't remember ITV doing much about it.
Oh, I did. Yeah, I did. It was on all the time. Yeah, ITN. Yeah, they had Alistair Burnett and Peter Fairley on there.
Oh, Alistair Burnett. Yes.
Yeah, they were doing like a phone-in. Yeah. They used to get the viewers to phone in questions about space, and Alistair Burnett, to every question, he used to say, "Good morning" or "Good afternoon." You're on the air. That's what I used to say every time.
It's a privilege.
Yeah, but it's quite interesting seeing what sorts of things that people asked about.
Now here's a question for you, because what fascinates me is, were you watching most of this on BBC Two or on BBC One?
It would probably be mostly BBC One because they had more coverage.
Because BBC Two had coverage in colour, of course.
Yeah.
But I think it was just restricted to targeted bulletins throughout the day.
If one channel stopped their coverage, then we'd go over to another one.
Yeah.
I think we'd just switch backwards and forwards. So it was like a continuous flow of coverage that we were watching, you know.
If it was during a quiet period when there was not much going on, you know, and there's a lot of theoretical discussion, we would tend to turn over because
my dad, you know, always had a phrase for these things. He used to say, "Oh, the I thinkers are on here." So, you know, if there's too much theorising
and not enough factual reporting.
On the later missions,
I
remember specifically Apollo 15, which was in 1971.
Yeah.
I had my dad's Philips cassette recorder, and I did an off-air recording.
Did you?
Held the microphone up to the speaker on the telly.
Oh, yeah. Did you get a nice bit of buzz with it?
Yeah, there's a little bit of background buzz, and I'd built an Airfix model of a Saturn V rocket.
Oh, yeah.
And so what I used to do, when the mission launched, I'd pick up this Saturn V rocket and I'd explain to my family what was happening. So like the first stage separates and I'd be holding it and I'd say, right now, first stage come away. And I've still got this audio recording of Apollo 15. And at the beginning of it, in the background, you could hear my dad going, "Oh, what's going on there then? It had no interest whatsoever." And I'm trying to explain the intricacies of the separation of the different stages.
You were trying to do like a live link to the BBC. Like.
Yeah, I was being James Burt, James Burt weren't picking them.
Yeah, you were keen.
I was very keen. I've still got the recording.
I bet the parents of your friends didn't get that sort of live on the spot model display.
Nobody got it at all. So, in fact, nobody got anything that I was interested in.
Well, it's the same for me. My interests were always very niche.
Trade test transmissions.
Yeah.
Apollo space program.
Yeah.
Watch with Mother.
Yeah.
Pop music or daytime schools programs.
Yeah. Rare if you could find one person that liked the same things. Yeah. That was true right through school life and right into adult life as well. I suppose it was inevitable sooner or later that, there was going to be some sort of mishap, with the space missions, wasn't it?
When Neil and Buzz landed on the moon,
yeah,
the inside of their spacecraft is tiny. There's very little room to move around.
Yeah.
And of course, when they got their spacesuits on and their backpacks, there's even less room. And at one point, Buzz Aldrin turned round and his backpack scraped against this panel which had all these circuit breakers on it.
Right.
And he broke one of the circuit breakers. And when they looked at it, it was the circuit breaker for the system for the ascent stage engine to get them off the moon. And he said that to make the system work, you have to press the circuit breaker in. But because he'd broken the plastic cover on it, he said, I knew that. He said, if I pushed it in, that's fine. But he said, if I ever needed to get it out again, I wouldn't be able to get it out. So they scurried around trying to work out what they were going to do. And they ended up using a biro and they shoved it in so that they could actually use that to pull the circuit breaker out if they needed to.
Right.
And if that hadn't worked, they'd still be there now.
That's flying by the seat of your pants, that is, isn't it?
And there were so many things like that where it was so close to just being disaster. But somehow they managed to pull it off,
being in a craft like that, it's not for somebody who suffers from claustrophobia, is it? I do remember, though, when we got to Apollo 13, I think I got up that morning. I remember my parents telling me there'd been some sort of accident. Yeah,
I remember that very well. I remember getting up and it was still dark in the morning. And my mum saying, there's been a problem. There's been an accident. Something's happened. And I remember thinking, oh, my God, can you imagine? It's pitch black. Halfway to the moon and something's happened. What the hell are you going to do?
It was very tense, wasn't it? I remember thinking it's quite grave and they really didn't know if they were going to get them back or not, did they?
No.
And I remember watching it live as it happened, sort of if there were any updates and that. And I think they were talking about they had limited power supply and I think they were forced to be in the dark some of the time, weren't they?
Yeah, they had to power down all their systems to save power.
I think they were running out of water, I seem to remember at one point as well.
Yes, they were running out of everything, really.
Yeah.
So they were in the command module, but the service module, which supplies it, that's where the explosion had been. So they'd lost all of their water, electricity, everything. So they had to use the lunar module to help them to get back.
It was high drama, though, wasn't it? I mean, it really was. Yeah. Because they definitely had a more serious tone, didn't they? I can remember Patrick Moore and James Burke sort of talking. It was not frivolous in the way that it was before.
No, and I remember a particular scene. I don't know if you remember seeing this one. They were waiting for the command module, the capsule, to come re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and they didn't know whether the heat shell had been damaged.
That's right. It could have burnt up on re-entry, couldn't it? That's right.
And there's a classic shot with James Burke sitting there waiting. You see the clock ticking down, and the camera zooms in on his hand, and you see he's got his fingers crossed.
Oh, right. I remember the moment when they re-entered the atmosphere, when they came back. I actually remember that because there was 10 minutes of silence, wasn't there, or whatever? And we didn't know if they were going to burn up and you wouldn't hear any more from them. Right. And then suddenly it came in and they splashed down.
And also, they came in at a slightly shallow angle, which meant it took longer to get through what they call a period of radio blackout.
There was a sort of sense of relief, wasn't there?
It was an incredible moment. But I think it was very shortly after that that they decided to cut the budget for Apollo.
Oh, really?
And the last 3 missions that were planned were cut. So
was it as a result of that?
Personally, I think it was like they thought, do we really need to do another 20 missions? So the last 3 missions, 18, 19, 20, were all cut, which is nice because when I go to the Kennedy Space Center, one of the rockets that would have flown but didn't is there on display.
Oh, is it? Right, okay. So they had 3 more planned, did they?
They had 3 more planned. So the last one was December 1972, and that was Apollo 17.
It's just a very small window when they're actually going to the moon, wasn't there? But after that, I was really expecting more. I was really expecting better things, bigger things, I
think that's the natural thing, isn't it? You think, well, we've been to the moon, let's go to Mars.
after the Apollo missions, my enthusiasm was really fired up for anything to do with space. I was looking for more space missions, what they're going to do next.
Yes.
It was a frustrating time. I was hungry for anything to do with space, and I just remembered in the early 70s you had the trade test film Behind the Spaceman, which was like a little nugget, in a kind of sea of nothingness.
Yeah.
It was like one of the few regular fixes of something to do with space that we got at that time, wasn't it?
Well, I mean,
I think it's the only trade test film I can think of that actually had a space thing.
Yeah, although, I mean, I really like that, of course. But ironically, they don't make any reference on it to the Apollo space program, the Saturn V rocket. It's all done in very kind of vague terms. It's almost like a poetry, I was thinking.
Perhaps that's a way of giving it a longer shelf life.
Maybe so.
But actually it's not sort of tied to anything specific.
That's right.
Mid-70s, I remember watching some of the Royal Institution lectures, at Christmas. And one year it was done by Carl Sagan, and he was talking about space and the cosmos and that.
Yeah, the Cosmos. Yeah.
And I remember being gripped by that because he used to talk about it with such enthusiasm, and it felt like, it was like a prelude to more space missions.
Yeah.
But it just never happened.
No.
He did that series Cosmos afterwards as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
My mum was interested in space as well, but she did like Carl Sagan, He was like a Swiss Tony of astronomy, wasn't he, really?
He reminded me of my French teacher, Mr. Bean.
Did he?
Who was also the music sort of director.
Oh, right, yeah.
He must have been the jazz club character from...
from the Fast Show, you mean?
From the Fast Show, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he was Mr. Cool. He was exactly like that. And Carl Sagan was a bit like that.
Yeah, he seemed like a bit like the housewife's choice, didn't he?
Oh, definitely, yeah. He could make physics sound sexy,
Yeah, I mean, my mum liked him. I mean, she didn't sort of express it in that way, but she was she used to like the way that he kind of put things across. I think he was quite a good communicator, but he was very smooth, wasn't he,
He was very smooth, very sexy.
Yeah. But, after Apollo 11, it really seemed like that was just a stepping stone into space after that. I thought we were going to have space stations and bases on the moon and everything.
Well, I think we were kind of fooled into thinking that's the first step, going to the moon first step, and then going to Mars being the next step, as if all the steps are like equal length.
Yeah.
You've got the moon is sort of effectively in our back garden, and then Mars, the distances involved are sort of multiplied by 400 times.
Yeah. That wasn't something that was conveyed at the time, was it?
No. There was just a feeling it's just the next step.
But when the Apollo missions ended, it was almost like they put a lid on it straight away, didn't they?
Yeah, they'd sort of done what they set out to do.
Because it very quickly evaporated, that whole atmosphere, because the whole world was buzzing about it, wasn't it, at first?
Yeah.
The space race just sort of ended.
Well, nobody's gone beyond low Earth orbit since Apollo 17. So that's 50 years ago.
I mean, we had the space shuttles, didn't we? And we had there's a disaster there, wasn't there?
Well, that's right. But it's all been in close Earth orbit.
Yeah.
Nothing beyond that.
No. The one thing that really did get me going, and I thought it was going to lead to something, was around about 1976. There was a Sky at Night special, and it was colour photos from the surface of Mars.
The Viking mission.
They sent an unmanned craft, didn't
Viking
they?
probe.
Really good quality
I
pictures.
Remember that. Yeah, I remember that very well.
But there was a real difference in terms of the amount of coverage between then and the golden days of '69. I think that was the only programme that really got any decent amount of publicity. All this stuff is off the radar as far as the public's concerned, isn't it? Because you couldn't escape the moon missions when they were happening. But that stuff that was happening then in '76 was quite in advance. But the Sky at Night was just about the only programme you heard anything about it. And I was absolutely fascinated by watching this programme. You saw the red sky and everything, and the pictures were great, and I thought, wow, I can't believe these are taken on Mars, And then nothing.
Very little. There's been a couple of probes there recently, of course.
Yes, that's right. There has, isn't there? Yeah.
And then a later mission is going to come along and land.
But still unmanned, or
still unmanned? Yeah. But I don't know when that's going to happen. They can do it. How much money are you prepared to spend?
They seemed to have an infinite amount of money at the time of the Apollo missions, and then they suddenly didn't.
They pumped as much money as they needed to into it to make it happen. Let's spend it on something other. We're going to get voted out of office.
In the long run, I think there's going to become a time when it might be practical to actually set up bases on the moon or wherever because of overpopulation.
Well, I think that's right. I think eventually we're going to have to.
I'm just wondering if it's ever going to be possible. Well, I suppose it will eventually, but I don't think anything isn't possible. But I wonder how long it's going to be before people can actually travel to other planets, you know.
Well, I think what needs to happen is they need to have the next generation of propulsion systems. So the stuff they've got now gets you to the moon in 2 days. It'll get you to Mars in about 9 months.
Yeah.
But there needs to be the next generation of propulsion systems which go a lot faster than that, so that these places are a bit more easy to get to within a short time scale.
It's either going to be that, or there needs to be a new system of physics to replace the old one.
Well,
you know?
Yeah. Well, the old transporter beam on Star Trek, that's what you need.
Well, he does. But I mean, we're still living in the age of Einstein and relativity, aren't we? And that law states that certain things aren't possible.
Yes.
So in order to do those things, you've got to create a system that says it is possible.
Well, if you could build a propulsion system that went, let's say, 10 times faster than current rockets, then that would make it more achievable. But you'd need something that's far more efficient.
It's usually science fiction that actually shows the way, doesn't it?
Yeah, very often, yeah.
I mean, like, for instance, if it's going to take years to get to the nearest inhabitable star or planet, then it means that trip, if it's going to take people, they're going to have to go into some kind of suspended animation, aren't they?
Yes.
So, I mean, that's a science fiction concept. So they've got to now find a way of actually making it possible.
Actually making it happen, yeah.
Yeah. I do think everything's possible, ultimately.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It's a perception thing.
Oof, now, I'll never forget. I was driving near my home.
Yeah.
Past this house, and there used to be this tree, big, thick tree.
Right.
Around there. And then one day I went past it, and the tree had apparently disappeared, but it was still there. The base of the tree was there, but somebody had sculpted out of the tree. It was like a lion or a lioness with its cubs, and they'd actually sculpted this out of the tree, and it looks absolutely fantastic. You know? And then I sort of thought about it, and I thought, if you think about it, that lioness and her cubs have always been there. All they've done is take away the bits of wood that were around it.
Yeah.
And revealed it.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, there's like an infinite number of things that could be inside that tree.
Yeah.
And all you've got to do is take away the other bits that don't represent that. And you've got another sculpture and another sculpture and another sculpture. And it's absolutely, within that tree trunk, you've got an infinite number of possibilities.
And this is like space, I suppose.
So in a way, it's a bit like space. It's sort of, infinity exists.
All the possibilities are held there. It's just that you've got to find them.
Yeah, yeah. And it was sort of like quite a profound thought.
Yeah.
I thought, God, that's always been in there. That shape, that wood I'm looking at, has always been there, but it's just been covered up by everything else.
It's like seeing it in reverse, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Rather than thinking, well, I've got to create something from this, it's like, well, it's always been there. It's just you've got to take away the bits that aren't it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's any number of things that could be in that tree, and then it's down to the skill of the artist to find it.
And the artist in this case being the scientists and physicists.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's like that with space. I think, it is all out there. Everything is possible. But it's a case of homing in on it and identifying it rather than actually creating it from scratch.
You're only limited by your imagination.
Yeah, that's right. Perhaps space travel by human beings in the future will finally get us to Alpha Centauri or something.
But then when you get there, what do you do when you get there?
Well, same as anything else. Go into a shop and see what local music's like.
What sweets they're selling.
What sweets they're selling, yeah, exactly, yeah. Might even run into the Robinson family.
Yes.
Because, when Lost in Space was cancelled, they must have ended up somewhere. Unless Dr. Smith polished them all off, yeah.
Don't think about it too hard.
Don't think about it too hard, yeah.
And the thing is now, it was just like when you went into sweet shop and you kind of drooled over the various sweets that you wanted to have.
Yeah, well it is, isn't it? It's like you've got all those planets out there and, which one do you choose? So many decisions.
And there we must leave them. Time to go home now. Why not pop in again soon to revisit some more old memories at the Time Warp Tavern. Last orders, please.